There are stories that sound too strange to be true, and yet they carry the scent of cold wind and old wisdom, the kind that only a man who has lived far from the noise of cities can tell. Up in the wild heart of Alaska, there was a hunter who learned something that few men ever do, that the wilderness rewards not just strength or skill, but understanding. His name was Eli Heron, and for 20 years he hunted the white-backed caribou that crossed the tundra north of the Yukon. But what made his story unforgettable was not how many he caught, nor how long he survived, but how one season he discovered that mirrors could do what bullets could not. It began with hunger, as most discoveries in the wild do. Eli lived alone in a cabin built from spruce logs that he cut and carried himself. The roof was covered in moss to keep the heat from escaping, and inside a single iron stove stood like a black heart that pulsed life into the frozen air. He was not a man of many words. Those who had met him in the trading post said his eyes carried both the calm of a sleeping bear and the edge of a man who had seen too much winter. He hunted not for pleasure, but for survival. Each caribou meant food, hide, sinew, and tools. But that year, something changed in the land. The herds had shifted their route, moving farther east, and for weeks Eli's traps stayed empty. His rifle, a .30 Lachaux that had never failed him before, hung on the wall untouched. The silence outside grew heavy, almost watchful. The tundra was testing him. He knew better than to fight the mountain's rhythm. So instead of forcing his will on the land, Eli watched. He studied the way the wind bent the snow, how the light moved across the valley at dawn, and how the distant herds hesitated at certain ridges. He realized that what made them run wasn't just sound or scent. It was reflection, a flash of light, a glint of ice, and they would turn, startled, their instincts flaring. That was when the idea first came to him, small and absurd like a spark in the dark. Mirrors, not for vanity, for deception. He remembered the small shaving mirror he had carried years ago, a gift from a woman he'd once loved, long before the mountains took him. He found it in a drawer under his bed, cracked, still catching light. He set it on a rock near his cabin and watched how it danced in the sun. The beam moved like a living thing, sliding over the snowdrifts, jumping from ice to ice. He thought of how the caribou feared strange flashes, how they gathered and turned away from what they didn't understand. If he could control that, bend it, aim it, perhaps he could guide them instead of chasing. For 3 days, Eli experimented. He propped the mirror on old rifle mount, positioned it at angles, and watched the effect from afar. Sometimes the beam blinded even him, scattering across the snow like fire, but other times shimmered softly, landing just where he wanted. He began to imagine lines of mirrors across the ridge, guiding the herd toward the frozen valley where he set his trap. It was a wild idea, the kind that only makes sense to a man who has no one to control. The day he first tried it, the temperature was 30 below, and the wind came down from the peaks like a living blade. He packed the mirrors, small round pieces cut from old metal tins, bits of glass polished smooth, and the cracked one he'd kept, and placed them across the valley in a pattern only he understood. He set them facing the direction of the morning sun, each one tilted to catch light at a different hour. When he was done, he stood back and looked at the land itself. Seemed to gleam faintly like it was waking up. Then he waited. The sun rose slowly, turning the ice into gold, and the first light struck the mirror across the tundra. Flashes appeared like signals, one after another, rhythmic, alive. The herd, a mile away, lifted their heads. They did not run, they watched. The light pulsed again, softer this time, and something strange. A caribou began to move toward it. Eli could hardly believe it. They followed the light as though it were a path drawn by curiosity, not fear. When they reached the valley, the snow gave way beneath them, where Eli had dug shallow pits camouflaged with frost. It wasn't a massacre. It was quiet, measured, efficient. He took only what he needed, as he always did. That night, sitting by the fire, he thought about what he had done. He had outsmarted not just the caribou, but the very idea of hunting. He had learned to guide instead of chase, to understand instead of conquer. It made him smile, that rare, quiet smile of a man who has seen the wilderness bend not through violence, but through patience. As days passed, the method evolved. Eli found that certain metals reflected differently. Copper drew their attention faster, while silver tones calmed them. He arranged the mirrors like a language only he could read, spelling out patterns that shifted with the sun. Neighbors from miles away began to notice. They saw the glimmers from their own cabins, strange lights dancing on the distant snow. Some thought they were spirits. Others said it was madness, a man living alone too long, losing his mind to the cold. But Eli knew better. The mountain was teaching him something ancient, that survival is not about dominance, but balance. He no longer carried his rifle on those hunts. He carried a pack of mirrors, a rope, and a knife. The mirrors became his weapon, his wisdom, his quiet rebellion against the world that believed only in force. When he walked through the tundra, the light followed him like an ally. Even the wolves seemed to watch him differently, no longer as prey or rival, but as something else entirely, something that belonged to the silent. There was a peace that came with it, the kind no man can find in noise or comfort. He learned to read the light like others read scripture. Morning light was honest. It showed the truth of the snow and the shape of the wind. Evening light were giving, soft and full of memory, and in those long Alaskan, when the aurora stretched across the sky, green fire, Eli would set one of his mirrors outside, just watch it dance within it. It reminded him that even the coldest places can hold beauty, if you learn where to look. You see, his story isn't just about mirrors, hunting. It's about a man learning to see beyond what most men do. When you live far from the world, when silence is your only companion, you begin to notice the things that others overlook. The sound of a single snowflake landing on frozen bark, the way your breath turns to crystal before vanishing into the dark. You begin to understand that survival is not a battle against nature, but a conversation. People later asked why he didn't patent his method or teach others. Eli would only smile. Some things, he said once, ain't meant to be owned. The mountains had given him that wisdom freely, and he would not sell it. What mattered wasn't the trick, but the understanding behind it, that sometimes to catch more of what you seek, you must stop chasing it altogether. When the spring thaw came, Eli's valley glittered like a field of glass. The snow melted around the mirrors, revealing small pools of clear water that reflected the sky. He walked among them like a man walking through memory. Each mirror held a piece of the winter, a fragment of his own solitude, and he realized something profound. He wasn't alone. The land was alive, the light was alive, and somewhere in that stillness he had found connection. If you've ever stood alone in the cold, watching your breath fade into the blue air, maybe you felt it too. Quiet pull of something bigger than yourself. It's what Eli felt. The world doesn't always speak in words. Sometimes it speaks in light. Tell me, where are you watching this story from? Somewhere cold like Alaska, or somewhere warm where you can only imagine the silence of snow? Long before the mirrors and the mountain, before his beard turned silver, and his voice took on that quiet weight that only solitude can give, Eli Heron had lived another kind of life, a noisy one, filled with machines, people, and the endless hunger of cities. He was born in Anchorage, the son of a fisherman who died too early, and a mother who believed that work was the only prayer worth saying. From an early age, Eli had been taught to move, to act, to never sit still long enough to hear his own thought. By the time he was 30, he was working as a surveyor for an oil company, charting the edges of wilderness that others planned to carve over profit. It was good money, more than he had ever imagined earning, but it came at the cost of something he didn't yet have the words to name. At first, he thought he was happy. He had a small apartment overlooking the harbor, a truck, and a woman who loved him, or at least believed she did, until she realized how little of him she actually knew. Her name was Mara, and she had eyes color of lake ice, beautiful, fragile, and always looking for a reflection. They had planned a life together, maybe even children someday, but Eli's work kept him away for months at a time. He would leave at dawn and return after weeks in the field, carrying the smell of diesel and frost. And though Mara would smile, there was distance, the kind that grows when two people live in separate worlds. One winter, he came home to find her gone. The note she left was short, almost too calm. "You belong to the silence more than you ever belonged to me." It took him a long time to understand what she meant. At first, he blamed her for giving up, for not being strong enough to handle the loneliness that came with his work. But later, when the noise of the city felt heavier than the snow he used to walk through as a boy, he realized she had only spoken the truth. The silence was in him, always had been. He kept working for 2 more years after she left. He buried himself in maps, numbers, schedules, thinking that logic could keep pain at bay. But each time he stood out in the field, surrounded by untouched land, he felt something stir, a kind of ache that wasn't sadness but longing. The land called to him not with words or promise, but with the quiet certainty of belonging. When the others saw wilderness as empty space, Eli saw it as a mirror of his own soul, vast, still, unbroken. Then came the accident. It was spring, though in Alaska, that still meant snow and wind sharpened skin. His team had been sent to mark new ground for drilling near the foothills of the Brooks Range. The ice was unstable, and the machines weighed too much. Eli warned them, but no one listened. Progress, they said, doesn't wait for. He was setting a marker when the ground beneath the lead vehicle gave way. The truck slid into a hidden crevasse, taking 2 men with it. They didn't survive the fall. Eli tried to reach them, climbing down with a rope tied around his waist, but the ice cracked again, forcing him to retreat. The sound of that break, the deep, hollow echo of the earth giving way, never left him. He left his job the next week. When he returned to Anchorage, he felt like a stranger in his own skin. The city seemed louder, faster, more artificial than he remembered. Friends tried to help, offering him work or company, but the words felt empty. He would wake in the middle of the night, hearing the wind howling through the ghostly echo of men calling for help. That was when he knew he couldn't stay. Some men drowned their pain in drink or work. Eli walked north. He sold what he owned, bought a rifle, an axe, and enough supplies for a season. Then he disappeared into the wilderness, following no map but instinct. Those first weeks were brutal. The cold stripped him bare, body and mind. He burned his hands chopping wood, tore his boots on ice, went days without proper food. But somewhere between the hunger and the exhaustion, a strange peace began to grow inside him. The silence stopped being his enemy. It became his teacher. He built his first cabin by a frozen lake, using trees bent by wind and snow. It was crude and small, but to him it felt like a cathedral. Each night he would sit by a fire and listen to the cracking of the log, the howl of wolves in the distance, the shifting groan of ice across the lake. Each sound had meaning, like a language older than men. He realized that he had spent most of his life surrounded by noise, but had never truly listened. Out there, every whisper of wind, every rustle of snow was a message if you learned how to hear it. The years passed slowly, marked not by calendars, but by the migration of animals and the rhythm of the season. He hunted with respect, took only what he needed, and buried the bones with care. He began keeping a small journal, though not of words, just sketches of the land, light, and weather. Sometimes he would carve symbols into wood, small reflections of what he had seen or felt. They were not meant for anyone else. They were his way of remembering that the mountain was not a place to escape the world, but a place to understand it. People in nearby settlements began to talk of the solitary man in the hills. Some said he was running from the law, others that he had lost his mind. But a few old trappers, men who had seen more winters than most could survive, said he was doing what every man dreams of, but few dare, living honestly, without noise or distraction. Eli didn't see it as courage. To him, it was necessity. The world below, with its engines and advertisements and restless chatter, felt like a kind of madness. Up there, surrounded by snow and stone, he could finally breathe. The mountain stripped away all the illusions, the need to prove, to possess, to be seen. What was left was truth. Hunger, cold, survival, gratitude. Over time, he stopped counting the years. He measured life by smaller things. The sound of the first thaw, the first caribou track after a long winter, the way sunlight shifted as summer returned. He grew older, slower, but stronger in spirit. He came to see himself not as a visitor in the wilderness, as part of it, like a stone shaped by the river. But even in solitude, memories have a way of following you. Sometimes at night, when the wind quieted and the fire burned low, he would see Mara's face in the glow. He wondered of the if she ever found peace, or if she too had become a ghost of her own past. He never hated her for leaving. In time, he understood that her departure, the first door the mountain opened without loss. There is no awakening. There were other ghosts, too. The men who died, he carried them in silence, never speaking their names aloud, but honoring them in the only way, by living with respect the land that took them. He believed that the earth remembers everything, that every footprint, every breath, every death leaves an imprint. And so he moved lightly, never wasting, never taking more than needed. The mountain had no mercy for greed, but infinite kindness for humility. It was during those years of reflection that the idea of mirrors first began to form, not as tools, but as symbols. Light, he realized, is like truth. It can guide, reveal, or blind, depending on how you use it. In a way, he saw his own life reflected in those pieces of glass he would later use to hunt, each one broken, scattered, yet still capable of catching the sun. Perhaps that's why he trusted them. They were imperfect, but they still reflected beauty. Eli's isolation was not born of bitterness. It was chosen, shaped deliberately like carving wood until it fits your hand. He found in solitude what most people spend their lives chasing in crowd, clarity. He no longer needed approval, love, or ambition to feel whole. The mountain had given him something deeper, contentment, and that, he believed, was the rarest thing a man could possess. Sometimes, during late summer, a bush pilot would land near the valley to trade supplies, flour, coffee, salt. They would talk briefly, and the pilot would always ask the same question, "You ever think about coming back?" Eli would smile, slow, knowing smile. "Back to what?" he'd say. There was no bitterness in his voice, only quiet amusement. The world he had left behind no longer called to him. The noise had lost its charm. You see, people often imagine solitude as emptiness, but Eli discovered it was the opposite. When everything unnecessary is stripped away, what remains is full of silence, yes, but also of presence. You begin to notice the rhythm of your heartbeat, the sound of your own breath blending with the wind, the pulse of the earth beneath your feet. You become aware not of loneliness, but of connection, deep, wordless, eternal. That was the reason for his isolation, not escape, not exile, but return. He hadn't run away from the world. He had simply gone home to a place older and truer than the one built of concrete and noise. If you ever wonder what drives a man to leave everything behind and live alone among snow and silence, think of Eli. He didn't flee from life. He walked toward it. And if this story speaks to you, if somewhere inside you there's a part that craves stillness, maybe that's the same call he once heard. You might not have to go as far as he did, but you can start by listening to the wind, to your own thoughts, to the quiet that waits behind the... And while you're here, take a moment to subscribe so you can walk with me through the next part of his journey, deeper into the wild heart of Alaska, where silence teaches more than any book ever could. There are mornings in the mountains when the world seems to hold its breath and even time forgets to move. Those were Eli's mornings. He would wake before dawn, when the stars still burned low and the sky glowed faintly. The inside, the air would be so cold, and each rose in front of him, ghost fading pale blue. He would sit for a while on the wooden step outside his cabin, not speaking, not thinking, just watching the slow birth of light over the ridge. To him, this silence was not emptiness. It was present, the mountain breathing, the world beginning again. In those hours before the sun rose fully, Eli felt closest to something divine, though he never called it God. He said once, silence is purest prayer a man can offer, the kind that doesn't ask or demand, only listen. He believed that in the city, people had forgotten how to listen. They filled every quiet space with noise, afraid of what they might hear if they didn't. But in the wilderness, silence wasn't a void to be feared. It was a teacher, and every lesson came softly, without word. Eli's days followed no clock but the one written in light. When the sun touched the tops of the spruces, he knew it was time to work. He split wood slowly, methodically, the sound of the axe echoing across the frozen ground. He would feed his stove, mend his traps, check his gear. Some days he hunted, others he simply wandered, following the tracks of wolves or the slow, graceful movement of a moose through the snow. He had learned to move quietly, to step where the snow was firm, to breathe with the rhythm of the wind. The forest accepted him as one of its. There were no voices, no engines, no conversation to fill the air, yet Eli never felt alone. The wilderness spoke in subtler ways, the creak of trees under frost, the ripple of a raven's wings as it passed over, the low moan of the ice shifting beneath the lake. Each sound was a kind of companionship, and each silence between them was like a heartbeat. He began to sense moods in the landscape, to feel when the mountain was calm or restless, when a storm was coming long before the clouds. Inside his cabin, life was simple. A pot of coffee always rested on the stove, and the smell of wood smoke lingered in everything he owned. The walls were light. He built him, holding jars of dried herb, meat, and small tools for years. On the table, there were always bits of metal and glass. His mirror, they caught the morning light through the single window and sent thin beams dancing across the log walls. He liked that. It reminded him that even the smallest things could hold light. During the long winters, when daylight lasted only a few hours and the world outside froze solid, Eli entered a kind of quiet rhythm that few could endure. The temperature would drop to 40 below. Snow would bury the land so deep that paths disappeared. In those months, he spoke even less, sometimes not at all for days. But he never lost himself in the silence. Instead, he found parts of himself he hadn't known existed. Thoughts came clearer, slower. He began to remember things he had forgotten, not memories of people, but of the warmth of sun on his back, boy, smell of the way his mother's hands had moved when she mended nets ashore. Memory became something alive again, not as regret, but as gratitude. He learned to make small rituals out of ordinary tasks. The lighting of the fire each morning became a ceremony, the sharpening of his knife, an act of meditation. Even eating was mindful, slow acknowledgement of effort, of life exchanged for life. He believed that gratitude was not spoken, but lived, and the mountain taught him how. Every act, even survival, could be sacred if done with awareness. Sometimes, when the storms came down hard and the wind screamed against his cabin walls, Eli would sit by the fire and listen to the fury outside. He said those nights reminded him that nature has its own kind of mercy. It destroys without malice and restores without reward. And when the storm passed, leaving the world reshaped and silent again, he would step outside and see that beauty and ruin were two sides of the same truth. In silence, he began to see himself different. The man who had once needed purpose and validation became someone who found meaning in stillness. He realized that solitude doesn't isolate. It clarifies. You begin to see which parts of you are real and which are borrowed from others. In that clarity, there is a strange kind of peace and a strange kind of power, too. He no longer needed the world's permission to exist. The mountain had given him its own, but silence, for all its peace, also holds mirrors, real and invisible. And in those mirrors, Eli saw not only the calm of the present, but the ghost of who he had been. There were days when he felt the weight of his old life pressing faintly against him. The city lights, the faces of men he'd worked with, the woman who once waited. Yet these memories no longer hurt. They were like distant stars, visible but untouchable, part of a sky he no longer lived under. He started keeping a kind of record in words, but in light. Using his mirrors, he placed them around his cabin in such a way that when the sun rose, the beams would travel slowly across the walls throughout the day, marking time without clocks. He said it helped him remember that life is movement, even in stillness. Sometimes he would sit and watch it shift for hours, as if reading a story written by the sun. There were small joys, too, humble, quiet. The first print of a rabbit after snowfall, the crackle of birchwood catching fire, the sweet taste of melted snow boiled for tea. Once he found a lynx cub caught in one of his traps. Instead of killing it, he freed it, nursing its leg until it healed. After that, the lynx often returned, keeping distance but never leaving entirely. He began to call it Smoke for the way it vanished into the trees. It was the closest thing to a companion he had, and sometimes he would speak to it soft, as if to another soul who understood the quiet. Seasons melted into one another, and Eli's life became a continuous song of adaptation. Spring brought floods and soft light that shimmered on the thawing lakes. Summer came with its swarms of insects and the call of distant thunder. Autumn was his favorite, the crisp air, the red of the tundra moss, the smell of earth preparing to sleep again. Each season taught him something new about endurance, change, about humility. One summer morning, he watched a caribou herd move across the valley, hundreds of them, flowing like a river of brown and white through the green. He felt no hunger to hunt them that day. He simply watched, fascinated by their unity, their silence. He noticed how they followed the light, turning instinctively toward brightness, never toward shadow. That was when the idea of mirrors returned to him more vividly than ever before. He saw that light was the oldest guide in the world, trusted even by creatures that had never seen fire. Eli spent hours thinking about what that meant. Maybe, he thought, men aren't so different. They too follow what shines, often without knowing why. Some follow gold, others love, others truth, but most don't understand light. It took living alone in the wild for him to see that not every brightness leads to warmth. Some lights burn, others heal. The difference is knowing how to look. In those silent years, Eli came to believe that the mountain was alive, not in a mystical way, but as a being with rhythm, mood, and spirit. It demanded respect, punished arrogance, and rewarded patience. To live there was to be in constant dialogue with it. The wind spoke, the snow answered, the man listened. He said once, "If you stay long enough, the mountain begins to speak your name, not in words, but in the way it lets you stay." There were no clocks, no calendars, no sense of progress, only life, pure, slow. And in that slowness, Eli found freedom that civilization never offered. He realized that time itself is a kind of noise, a pressure that exists only where men measure it. In the mountain, time dissolved into experience. A day could feel like a lifetime, and a lifetime like a single day. People who have never lived in silence think it's empty, but it isn't. Silence full of whisper, of echo, of memories too soft to survive the noise of the world. Eli learned that every silence tone, the deep silence of snow, the restless silence before rain, the gentles of dawn. He collected them like others collect songs, and in each one he heard a truth that words could never hold. By the 5th year, Eli had forgotten what it felt like to need company. Loneliness had been replaced by presence. The world around him was enough, so alive that even breathing felt like communion. He once said that in the mountains, you stop being a man who lives in nature and become a piece of nature that still remembers being a man. That was life in silence, a life where every moment was both small and infinite, where survival became art, and where peace was earned. It was not an escape from the world, but a deeper entrance into it. For Eli, it was not loneliness. It was belonging. It was in his 8th winter alone when the mountain decided to test him. The storms that year were heavier, darker, as if the sky itself had grown weary of holding its weight. For days, Eli could barely see past his porch. The wind howled like something alive, tearing at the edges of his cabin and filling every crack with snow. Even the animal had vanished. The silence that usually comforted him had turned into something else, dense, almost watchful. It wasn't loneliness that visited him then, but the raw presence of the mountain reminding him that peace must be earned, not assumed. The food he had stored began to dwindle. The caribou herds, once predictable, had shifted their path again. For the first time in years, he felt the old hunger, both in body and in spirit. There's a kind of hunger that doesn't come from the stomach, but from the soul, a gnawing sense that something within you is being measured. That was what Eli felt. He knew that survival in the wilderness wasn't about beating the land. It was about understanding what it demanded. When the storm finally broke, it left the world reborn and strange. The snow had piled so deep that his cabin looked half buried, like an old memory the mountain had tried to forget. Eli stepped outside and felt the air bite at his skin. The sky was so clear it hurt to look at. He needed food, and soon. He packed his rifle, though he carried it more from habit than intent, and set off toward the valley where he had seen the herds before. For 2 days he found nothing but empty tracks. The snow was too deep, the cold too fierce. On the 3rd day, he reached the ridge overlooking the frozen plain. From there, he saw them, a distant line of caribou moving slowly through the mist. But they were far, farther than he could reach without risking days of travel. He watched them through the scope of his rifle, their shapes blurred by heatless sunlight. He lowered the gun. He had long since lost the appetite for killing out of desperation, but hunger leaves little room for pride. He sat on a rock and waited, thinking, his breath forming small clouds that vanished instantly. That he saw it, the way the light flickered off a patch of snow in the distance, catching the eyes of the caribou and making them hesitate. The reflection reminded him of the mirrors he had left behind at his cabin. A thought stirred, half memory, half intuition. He began to see a path in his mind, a way to bring the herd closer, not with force, but with light. He returned home by nightfall, exhausted but alive with purpose. For hours he worked by lamplight, cleaning the small piece of mirror he'd used. He cut new ones from old metal lids, polished with ash and cloth, and arranged them on a map sketched into the table's surface. He remembered how light moved during different, and he planned it carefully. Each mirror would catch the sun at a hour, leading the herd as if by invisible. At dawn, he began. The air was so still it seemed to listen. He carried the mirrors one by one, planting them along the ridge, the frozen stream that led into the valley below. It took hours, his hands raw and bleeding from cold metal, but when he finally stepped back, the valley looked almost enchanted. Tiny flashes of light waiting for the sun to wake them. When the sun finally rose, the mirrors came alive. Beams shot across the snow in a chain of glittering signals, soft and hypnotic. From the far end of the valley, caribou stirred. Their heads lifted, their ears twitched. Slowly, cautiously, they began to move toward the light. Eli watched from behind a boulder, his heart steady but full. The plan worked. The light was like a song, and the herd followed it. They came closer, drawn not by fear but by curiosity. He waited until they were near enough, then carefully stepped into their path. The herd froze. 100 eyes stared at him, reflecting the same light he had used to draw them in. For a moment, everything stopped. The world, the wind, even his breath. It felt like standing inside the pulse of the earth. He could have raised his rifle, ended his hunger with a single shot, but he didn't. Something inside him had shifted. The caribou were no longer prey. They were mirrors themselves, showing him what he had become. He lowered the gun. He knew now that the mountain's challenge hadn't been hunger. It had been faith. Faith in the quiet understanding he had built with the land. He watched the animals move past him, their hooves breaking the surface of the snow with soft, muffled sounds. They were beautiful, wild, untamed. He smiled and let them go. Eli took only one later that week, with respect and precision, using his knife rather than his rifle. He thanked the animal, as he always did, his hand resting briefly on its neck. He believed that every life taken should teach something, and that one taught him what all the years in the mountains had been leading to, the power of restraint. The true hunter, he realized, is not the one who kills most, but the one who knows when not. That winter, something deeper changed him. He began to see the mirrors not just as tools, symbols, reflections of balance. The caribou had followed the light because it spoke to an ancient instinct. And in guiding them, Eli had learned to guide himself. He started using the mirrors for more than hunting. He placed them in places where they could catch the last light of day, sending beams flashing across the hills like messages to no one. Maybe he believed the mountain could see them. Maybe he just liked the beauty of it. But the mountain wasn't done with him yet. A few weeks later, another storm came, fiercer than the last. For 3 days, he couldn't leave. The snow buried the door, and ice crept through the gaps in the walls. When it finally eased, he went outside and found that half his mirrors had vanished, buried, shattered, or carried off by the wind. He searched for them, digging through the drifts until his fingers went numb. That was when he found the first sign that something else had been watching. Track, not caribou, not wolf, human, faint, half-covered, leading down toward the river. It had been years since he'd seen another person this far out. He followed the tracks carefully, moving slow. They led to a small shelter built from snow and branches barely holding together. Inside, he found a young man, half frozen, starving, barely conscious. Eli dragged him back to the cabin, fed him warm broth, and waited. When the boy finally opened his eyes, he looked at Eli with confusion and fear. The boy's name, Thomas. He was a trapper from the south who had lost his way in the storm. He had seen the flashes of light from Eli's mirrors and followed them, thinking they were signals from a rescue plane. "You saved me," he said, voice trembling. Eli didn't answer right away. He looked at the boy and realized truth. Those mirrors had saved him too, but in a different. Thomas stayed for a few weeks, regaining his strength. They spoke little. The boy was restless, full of the noise of the world Eli had long left behind. He asked questions about the mirrors, the solitude, the endless. "Don't you ever get tired of it?" he asked, as the fire burned low. Eli smiled faintly. "You only get tired of having learned to." When the snow softened enough for travel, Thomas prepared to leave. Before he went, Eli gave him one of the small mirrors and wrapped a cloth. "For light," he said simply. The boy nodded, though he didn't fully understand. Years later, people in a distant village would talk about a young trapper who claimed he survived a storm because of a man who caught light on the mountain. Most thought it was just a story. Some said they'd seen flashes on the horizon that winter, like the sun speaking through ice. That was how Eli's discovery became legend, not because he used mirrors to catch caribou, but because he used them to reflect something far older, the idea that understanding is stronger than force, and that the brightest light is often born from darkness. He kept refining his craft, adjusting angle, polishing surface, creating what he called his language of light. He said it reminded him of music, each reflection a note, each day a song. Sometimes he used the mirrors to mark the path of the sun across the sky, sometimes to lead animals safely away from frozen rivers. The mountain, once his test, had become his partner. That spring, as the snow melted and the streams began to sing again, Eli stood on the ridge at dawn, the mirrors around him glowing with the first light. The valley shimmered, alive with quiet motion. For a moment, he thought of the man he had been, the one who measured success in numbers and noise. That man was gone. What remained was something simpler, truer, a reflection, perhaps, of the light itself. And that day, when he watched the world awakening below him, he felt a peace so deep it silenced even thought. He had found what most men spend their lives chasing and never name. It wasn't victory. It was understanding. If you've followed him this far, you've walked through storms and silence, through hunger and revelation. And if the light of his story reaches you, take it as a small mirror for your own journey. Sometimes what guides us isn't strength or speed, it's reflection. And maybe, like Eli, you'll find that the right light can lead you home. Before we continue deeper into his journey, take a moment to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The mountain's final lesson and the truth's only silent reveal. By the time Eli reached his 10th winter on the mountain, he had become something that no longer quite fit the word hunter. The rifle still hung on the wall above the stove, cleaned, oiled, and silent. But it had not fired in years. His traps lay half buried beneath snow and moss, forgotten. The cabin itself seemed less like a shelter and more like a part of the mountain now, its logs darkened by weather, its roof lined with snow thick as memory. The man who once sought to survive had learned instead to belong, and in that belonging he began to see the world not as wilderness and civilization, but as a single reflection split by misunderstanding. He often sat on the ridge overlooking the valley, where the light struck his mirrors at dawn, scattered like 1,000 silent voices. He would watch the beams move across snow, chasing one another, fading, returning. To anyone else, it might have looked like chance. To Eli, it was rhythm. He saw the same movement in the clouds, in the herds, in the breath of the wind itself. The world, he realized, was one great cycle of reflection, light upon water, memory upon man. He started speaking softly to himself, not out of loneliness, but as a way of thinking aloud to the mountain. We spend our lives trying to see ourselves, he murmured, but all we ever see is a light bouncing. The mountain, as always, said nothing, but he felt it, listening. Years in solitude had stripped away the noise of other people's thoughts, leaving behind something sharper and more honest. He could see patterns now in the smallest things, the way snowflakes gathered on bark, the way frost crept across a window like veins, the way the sun moved between the peaks in perfect rhythm. It made him wonder whether human beings were the only ones who had lost their sense of place. Perhaps everything else still remembered how to live in harmony, and only man had forgotten. He began reflecting more often on his old life, but not with regret. Memory came to him like light glinting off ice, sudden, brief, beautiful. He would think of the streets of Anchorage, of the crowds, of the sound of engines and laughter and music spilling from bars on Friday nights. There had been warmth there, too, he knew, but it was a warmth that came from proximity, not peace. People gathered close because they were afraid of their own silence. He could see that. Civilization wasn't evil. It was simply noisy, always talking over the things that mattered most. Sometimes, when the nights were long and the aurora stretched across the sky, slow-moving river of fire, Eli would stand outside and feel the pull of both worlds. He loved the wildness of the mountain, but part of him also understood the ache of the city, the constant search for meaning, the yearning to fill the emptiness with sound. He realized then that he had not escaped the world. He had only stepped far enough away to see it clearly, and what he saw was simple. Men were not broken, only distracted. They had forgotten how to be still. He once said, "The world isn't sick because of what we do. It's sick because of what we refuse to stop doing." He had seen men tear through forests, mine through mountains, and call it progress. But standing where he was now, surrounded by unspoiled snow and light, he saw that progress meant nothing without purpose. To live was not to conquer, but to coexist, to take only what you could thank. The mirrors became his philosophy. He saw in them a lesson deeper than any sermon. Light, after all, does not choose where it falls. It touches the beautiful and the broken alike, revealing both without judgment. That was the way he tried to live, without judgment, without claim. He had stopped asking why things happened and began instead to ask what they revealed. Every hardship, every storm, every moment of hunger or pain had been a mirror showing him something about himself. He started writing again, not words meant for others, but small notes carved of wood or bone, messages for the wind perhaps. Light does not belong to the one who catches. Silence teaches only those who stay long enough to hear. What you chase will always run, but what you understand will come to you. They filled the cabin slowly, etched into beams, stones, the backs of mirrors. He never meant for anyone to read them, but somehow he knew someone would someday. There were days when he wondered what the world had become. The mountain. He imagined the cities growing louder, brighter, more restless. He thought of screens and noise and men who measured success in numbers. Instead, he pitied them in a quiet, tender way. They were chasing their own reflection, just as he once had. He believed that every man is a reflection of the world he builds around him. If the world is loud, he becomes noise. If the world is silent, he becomes peace. He had chosen silent, not because it was easier, but because it was true. The mountain did not lie. It never promised comfort, but it always delivered honest. One afternoon in late summer, Eli the air was thin, higher than usual. Sky an impossible blue. From up there, he could see the entire valley, his cabin, the lake, the paths of light from his mirrors. It looked small, almost fragile, against the immensity of stone and sky, and yet, he realized, it was enough. A man doesn't need to be large to matter. He only needs to live rightly in the space he's given. He sat there until the sun began to set, and as the light faded, he thought about all the men who would never see what he saw, who would live their entire lives chasing shadows of happiness without ever standing still long enough to let peace. He wanted to tell them that peace was not the end of any road. It was beneath the hidden stillness waiting. As he descended the ridge, he found a pool of meltwater gathered between them. The surface reflected the sky so perfectly that for a moment it seemed like he was looking into another world. He leaned closer and saw his own face staring back. Older, lined, eyes bright, but tired. He didn't flinch. He smiled faintly and said, "So it's you, after all." It was the first time in years he had seen himself, and it felt like meeting an old friend. That night, he built a fire outside and sat watching the stars. Smoke, the lynx, appeared again at the edge of the clearing, silent as ever. The animal sat beside him for a while, its golden eyes catching the firelight. Eli reached down and touched its fur. "We're not so different, are we?" he said softly. "Both of us just learning how to live without taking." The lynx blinked slowly, then vanished back into the trees, leaving only paw prints silent. Eli thought then about the nature of man, how people spend their lives trying to master the world, only to be mastered by their own desire. He had learned that freedom doesn't come from doing whatever you want. It comes from wanting less. The mountain had taught him that. Implicit, there was strength in silence, wisdom in solitude, connection. He wondered what would happen when he died. Would anyone remember? Would his cabin fall back into the earth, his mirrors rust and fade to snow? And that didn't trouble him. He smiled at everything beautiful appeared. He said, but that's what makes it. Sometimes he imagined that maybe someone would find his valley one day, a wanderer, lost like he once was. Maybe they would see the flashes of light from his old mirrors and follow them. Maybe they would find the cabin, read his carvings, and understand. Or maybe they wouldn't. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the mountain would still be there, and the light would still find its way through the snow, whether or not anyone was there to see. The more Eli thought about the world, the more he realized how little of it truly needed fixing. The rivers still ran, the trees still grew, the snow still fell. The problem wasn't the world, it was man's blindness to its grace. He believed that the only real progress left was inward, not outward. If every man learned silence, he said once, the world would heal faster than any law could make it. He had become something rare, perhaps even misunderstood, a man who didn't want more. And in that wanting less, he had found everything. The reflection of the world and the man had merged. He no longer saw himself as separate from the mountain. The wind was his breath, the snow his blanket, the light his language. He didn't pray to nature. He lived inside its prayer. That was his revelation, that a man can live his whole life searching for meaning, only to find it waiting quietly in the stillness he feared most. And so he stayed, each year, older, slower, but at peace. The mountain watched him as it watched everything with patience. When storms came, he endured. Spring returned, he rejoiced. When hunger struck, he took what was given and thanked it. When loneliness whispered, he smiled and answered, "You're not real anymore." That was Eli's reflection of the world, of man, of light itself. A man once made of noise had become silent. A hunter once chasing life had become part of it. In his final years, Eli Heron moved more slowly, but not with sadness or fear. His hair had turned the color of ash, his beard grown thick and soft like the fur of a winter wolf. The lines around his eyes were carved by wind and laughter, not regret. He often said that growing old on the mountain didn't feel like approaching the end. It felt like returning to where he had always belonged. He could sense it in the way the earth accepted his steps, how the birds no longer startled when he passed, how even the storms seemed to pause when he stood in the open. The mountain had taken him in fully now, not as a visitor, but as one of its own. Each morning he still rose before dawn, though the work had grown lighter. The mirrors remained scattered across the ridge and valley, catching the early sun like pieces of forgotten sky. Some had tarnished, some cracked, yet each still caught a spark of light. He often walked among them, touching their cold surface as if greeting old friends. "You've done well," he would. "You've lasted longer than most men." They were his companion, his disciple flexion. Through them the mountain still spoke. Eli no longer hunted. His diet came from what the land freely offered: fish from the stream, roots, berries, the occasional gift from passing trappers who still spoke of him in half-whispered awe. To them, he had become a legend, the lightkeeper of the tundra, the man who hunted with mirrors. Some said he was over 100 years old. Others claimed he had become part of the mountain itself. The stories traveled far, changing with every retelling, but Eli never cared for legend. He lived quietly, unseen, content that truth did not need an audience. One winter evening, as the first snow began to fall, he sat by his fire and watched the flames move within one of the mirrors. The reflection shimmered like a dream. He thought of the life behind, the woman named Mara, the city lights, the machines, the endless talking. For the first time in many years, aloud to her memory. "You were right. I did belong to the silence. But maybe, if you could see it now, you'd understand that the silence loved me back." Outside, the snow fell harder, thick, slow, muting even the crackle of his fire. Eli stood, took his fur coat from the wall, and stepped into the night. The valley below was silver and endless. The stars burned low, blurred by snowfall, and the air had that sacred stillness that only the deep cold can bring. He walked toward the ridge where the mirrors lay buried beneath frost. One by one, he uncovered them, brushing away the snow with careful hand. The moonlight struck them faintly, enough to cast small glimmers across the dark. He watched them for a long time. There are moments in a man's life when he knows that he has reached the end of his journey, not with fear, understanding. Eli felt that then. He wasn't dying, he was completing. The mountain had given him everything, a place to live, lessons to learn, a way to see. Now it was time to give something back. The next morning, the storm had cleared. From miles away, travelers would later say they saw flashes of light across the valley, sharp, rhythmic, like a message. Some thought it was sunlight bouncing off the ice. Others swore it was deliberate, a signal too precise to be chance. But none could say what it meant. Only Eli knew. It was his farewell. He had arranged the mirrors to catch the rising sun one last time, forming a pattern that only the mountain could read, a message written in light. He returned to his cabin, sat by the fire, and opened his small journal. On the last page, he carved a few words with his knife. Steady, deliberate, do not chase what runs. Learn instead why it runs. The mountain will teach you if you are still enough to hear. He set the knife down, leaned back, closed. Outside, the light flickered once more across the snow, then faded as the day turned to gray. Weeks later, when a trapper came to trade and found the cabin quiet, he knew the fire had burned out. The bed was neatly made. Eli's body lay beside the window, hands folded, his face peaceful. On the wall behind him, the morning sun hit a small mirror and cast a beam of light across his. The man buried him just outside, beneath the tree that grew crooked from years of wind. No marker, no word, just a stone placed carefully on the mound. He gathered the mirrors and left them where they were, saying softly he'd want the light to stay. As the seasons passed, the story of Eli Heron spread farther than he ever imagined. Travelers spoke of a hidden valley in Alaska, where the snow sometimes glimmered like glass even on cloudy days. Scientists visited, curious of the phenomenon, only to find small mirrors half buried in moss and ice, aligned in strange patterns. Some said it was art. Others called it spiritual. But none could deny that standing there felt different, that the air seemed fuller, the silence heavier, the light more alive. Those who stayed long enough often claimed they heard things, not voices exactly, but impressions, saw wordless thoughts that seemed to rise from the earth itself. A few even said that when the wind passed through the valley just right, it sounded like a man's laughter carried faintly in the snow. Years turned to decades. The cabin aged, collapsed, then sank into the ground. The mountain reclaimed it, plank by plank, nail by nail, until only the stone that marked his grave remained. Yet the mirrors endured. Some rusted, others cracked, but enough survived to keep his message alive. Even when covered in frost, they caught the smallest rays of light and sent them wandering across the tundra like whispers of an old secret. Long after his death, a photographer once came to the valley at dawn, drawn by rumors of strange reflection. He waited with his camera ready, and when the first light touched the snow, he saw it. Beams of gold and silver darting across the white expanse in perfect rhythm. He took his picture, awed by the beauty, but what stayed with him it was silent. It felt alive, dense, like standing inside the memory of a prayer. He left with tears frozen to his beard, though he didn't know why. Later, when his photographs were displayed, people called the place the Valley of Mirrors. Some thought it a natural wonder, others a man-made mystery. A few who studied the alignment of the mirrors realized that together they formed a pattern, a spiral leading toward a single point. When they traced it on a map, it led directly to the stone where Eli lay buried. That was his legacy, not fame, not a simple reflection but left light behind to teach anyone willing to see. He had lived without noise, greed, without need for witness, and yet his silence had outlived him, whispering truths into the hearts of strangers he would never meet. And maybe that's the way it should be. The world doesn't need more men shouting what they've done. It needs a few who can listen to what's already there. Eli's life proved that peace isn't something you find by escaping others. It's something you uncover by escaping yourself. When you stop fighting the silence, it stops being your enemy and becomes your mirror. There are people who still visit the valley. They come quietly, some with heavy hearts for meaning. They stand among the mirrors and close their eyes, and though no one speaks, many say they leave. They feel smaller but freer, lighter, as if the mountain had taken something from them, not as punishment but as relief. And when they walk away, some turn back and see it, a faint glimmer on the ridge, like sunlight moving where there should be none. They say it's just reflection, but a few believe it's him, the old hunter, still watching, still guiding, still catching light. Maybe that's true, maybe it isn't, but if you stand there long enough, you begin to understand what Eli understood. The world speaks, but only in silence. And when you finally learn to listen, you realize it's been waiting for you all along. So if you ever find yourself lost in the noise of cities, in the rush of ambition, in the loneliness that hides beneath constant movement, remember the man who caught more caribou with mirrors than bullets, not because he was clever, but because he learned what the world had been trying to teach him since the beginning, that understanding is stronger than force, that patience is braver than conquest, and that the quietest men often leave the loudest echo. And if his story touched something in you, something still and wordless, then maybe, in your own way, you've already stepped onto the mountain too. Before you go, take a moment. Let the silence sit with you. Feel the light on your skin wherever you are. Then, if you wish, share this story so the light travels further, as Eli's did. Leave a comment, tell where you are listening from, and subscribe to hear more of these quiet truths from the wild places where men like him once walked, because somewhere high in the frozen north, the light still moves across snow, and the mountain still whispers the name of the man who listened long enough to understand it.